Good morning, everyone. In this presentation, we will tackle about the purposes of assessment or the approaches of assessment. There are three purposes of assessment, namely assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. In assessment for learning occurs when teachers use inferences about students' progress to inform their teaching. In assessment of learning occurs students reflect on and monitor their progress to inform their future learning goals. And in assessment as learning occurs when teachers use evidence of students' learning to make judgment on students' achievement against goals and standards. Okay, for further understand of the three purposes of assessment, let it have it one by one. Let us start in assessment for learning or also known as assessment para sa pagkatuto. It is a formative type of assessment used by the teacher to inform their teaching. It may occur before and throughout the learning sequence to determine the progress and the gaps. It may occur before and throughout the learning sequence in order to determine the progress, that means learning progress and the learning gaps. From the word format, this means that the teacher examined all the activities in class and used those evidences whether to retouch the concept or to move on to the next lesson. Example for assessment for learning, these include seat works or diagnostic test before conducting the real discussion, Q&A during discussion or question and answer during discussion, and quizzes. So, in assessment for learning, the results are recorded but not graded or not part of the grading. Basically, assessment for learning is done to improve the teaching and the learning process. So there are 5 case strategies in assessment for learning. Okay, number 1, sharing learning expectation. Specify what students should know and be able to do as they strive to achieve learning goals. Eliciting evidence. Students engage in a performance that makes their thinking thinkable. Then, feedback. Of course, provide effective feedback that motivates the learning and can lead to improvement. Then, self-assessment. The process of looking at oneself in order to assess aspects that are important to one's identity. And then the last is the peer assessment. Provide a structured learning process for students to critique and provide feedback to each other on their work. And now let's proceed to assessment of learning or also known as assessment ng natutunan or pagkatuto. It is a summative type of assessment used by the teacher to determine what students have learned in a unit or chapter against a specified standard or goal. Assessment of learning is done at the end of every unit in chapter in order to certify the student's competence. Example of assessment of learning include the mastery test, periodic test for basic education, achievement test for in the college like prelim, midterm, semifinal, and final. In assessment of learning are assessment for grading purposes, and this type of assessment are usually the one being reported. And now let us go to assessment as learning or assessment bilang pagkatuto. This is what we call self-assessment or students' metacognition. This is also a formative in nature wherein the students are given the opportunity to monitor and critically reflect their own learning and prepare the necessary adjustment for their learning. This is a self-directive learning as well, wherein the students use their metacognitive process to think about their own learning, what strategies to support that particular learning, and the mechanism that they will use to advance the learning. The example of assessment as learning, these include reflective journal or reflections, and insights. Okay, and assessment as learning is the highest form of assessment that is used for students to monitor their own learning process. Function of assessment as learning: encourage students to take responsibility for their own learning, require students to ask questions about their learning, and involve teachers and students creating learning goals to encourage growth and development. Provide ways for students to use formal and information feedback and self-assessment to help them understand the next step in learning, and encourage peer assessment, self-assessment, and reflection.
And now to sum up the purposes of assessment. Assessment for learning, or EFL. This is done by the teacher formatively to improve teaching and learning process. Next, assessment of learning, or AOL. This is also done by the teacher summatively or at the end of the unit for grading purposes. And the last is assessment as learning. This is done by the students to monitor their own progress. This is talking about reflections and insights. And that's all. I hope you learned something in this presentation.